Welcome to Inside the Chamber. I'm Adam Russo, Board Chair of the Naperville Area Chamber of Commerce. We have a special show for you today. We have the pleasure of interviewing Geoff Colvin, best-selling author and editor-at-large of Fortune magazine. Today we'll be discussing his latest book, Humans Are Underrated. Thank you, Geoff, for being here today.
My pleasure.
I'd like to get started by just asking, what's your interest in economics? Why get involved in the first place?
You know, it's a funny thing because I became interested in it when I was a kid. And it's one of those weird things. I can remember the moment when I was sitting on a sofa in my grandparents' house. I was about 8 years old, and I wondered, why is money worth anything? That is, why could you take a little piece of metal, because I'd never had any paper money at that point in my life, but why could you take a little piece of metal and exchange it for something that was truly valuable, like a Snickers bar? And I honestly, I couldn't understand why the money, why that was valuable. And so that's what actually got me started an awful long time ago. What I've come to realize is that it is not a dry theoretical discipline. It is the study of how people can have comfortable, prosperous, long, healthy lives. I mean, this is what it's really about. We spend a lot of time with equations and stuff like that, but we're talking about how people live, whether it's good or bad day to day. And so it is a living, breathing discipline for sure.
Absolutely, and so how do you take that living, breathing discipline, right? And then when you translating it into being an editor at a major magazine, what's that bridge like for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, the answer is it's fairly obvious for me. I mean, it's pretty easy because business organizations are, you could say, the mechanism from which economics gets translated into real life for millions of people, whether they're big organizations or small or entrepreneurial, whatever. That's how it becomes real for people. And so, companies, especially big companies, take a lot of criticism. It's popular to criticize them. If you ask in public opinion polls what people think of big business, they always hate it. If you ask them about small business, they always love it. But this is where economics gets turned into real life. Big business organizations only developed at the end of the 19th century.
So in connecting that bridge, what then led you to write books?
Yeah. Books have a power. It's quite amazing because you could argue in theory that they shouldn't. For one thing, people are constantly wanting to read shorter things, right? Articles are getting shorter in general and stuff like that. In addition, as all content becomes digital, it's like, who cares really what form it takes? But the fact is, through all of it, books have retained a certain power. There is something about, the physical package of the book, but even if it is in digital form, about the fact that there is this substantial piece of work on a topic to which someone has devoted a whole lot of time that still creates influence for books that, as far as I can tell, has not waned. And so that's where my interest in that came from.
And then what took you to the topics that you've been writing about? Most recently, the humans are underrated. What took you into that specific area, given we talk about at the beginning money and value?
Right.
It's a pretty big transition from money and what gives it value to the people place.
What's that connection? It is, and for whatever reason, I've always had these two great interests in my work, which seem in some ways like opposite ends of a spectrum. One is very financy. Corporate finance is a great interest of mine related to economics and so forth. And then the other end of the spectrum, the human element of work, the nature of human beings, how humans get good at anything they do, how they add value in businesses or in any role that they play in life. That's always interested me a lot as well. And so, honestly, when I am looking around, just absorbing everything that's happening in the world, I particularly pay attention to those things. And I wrote these books because I noticed a lot happening. I noticed stuff happening. So that, you know, the Talent is Overrated book I did because there was this research out there. There was 30 years of research on why some people are such great performers at whatever they do, and most people are not such great performers. There was this really good research that explained it, and the research was not widely understood. So I thought, well, I'll tell that story. And that has clearly resonated with a lot of people. The more recent book, Humans Are Underrated, arose again from just looking around, but in this case, looking at what was perfectly obvious, which was people getting very anxious, very worried as technology does more and more of what people used to do. We see technology doing what it has always done, which is eliminate some jobs, but doing so at a pace that we've never seen before, and going into kinds of work that we never thought machines would be able to do. So the obvious example that we see, of course, is autonomous cars. But there are so many, many other examples. So there's this tremendous anxiety. And that's what caused me to do Humans Are Underrated.
And in there, you talk a lot about empathy and the
Yes.
value of empathy.
Yes.
How do you see kind of a difference between the connection between people as individuals and being empathic there? But then a lot of people might make a perception of well business isn't really empathic to its workers. So what's kind of the bridge that you see in that?
Empathy is understanding what somebody else is feeling and thinking, whatever it may be. The reason it is so important to how we add value is that we are hardwired from our evolutionary past to be that way. We have built into us mechanisms for understanding what somebody else is feeling and thinking. And it's more than we realize. It's all kinds of stuff that happens beneath the level of our consciousness, but it's happening anyway. So this is turning out to have a lot of economic value. Now, so how do companies behave toward their employees? Actually, there's tremendous variation. Some of them are very empathetic toward employees. And in fact, at Fortune magazine, we publish an annual list of the 100 best companies to work for. And whenever we have analyzed the performance of those companies, and by the way, outside third parties have also analyzed the performance of those companies, guess what? The big non-surprise is they outperform average companies. They are more economically successful. They empathize with their employees, meaning they understand what those people are thinking and feeling, and they respond in some appropriate way. And, it is indeed economically valuable.
Sure. And then when you look at millennials and the tech, the information age and that generation and kids getting older now who are in school, maybe going to college, will eventually enter the workforce. What exactly do you think that these educational systems need to start doing in order to best prepare this generation for what they need to be doing to be successful as they get older?
Yeah, we see a lot going on there because educators are realizing that what they need to teach students is changing as the economy changes in just the way you described. Some of them are realizing that it is now part of their job to teach students at every level these deep human skills of interaction, empathy being the foundation of all the others, but the deep skills of human interaction. And so we see programs, as I say, at every level. At the kindergarten and very early primary level, there are programs that are now being spread around the U.S. and other countries. There's one called Roots of Empathy, which explicitly exists to teach kids this. And it does it in an ingenious way. They bring in a baby And it's the same baby over the course of the school year. Beforehand, the teacher talks with the kids about what this baby is like, what at this point the baby feels and thinks, to the extent it thinks anything. And then they observe it, and then they talk after, and they interact with it, and they try to understand what's going on with that baby. And then afterwards they talk about it. And it's effective in part because they understand that the baby is genuine. The baby isn't faking anything because it can't. This is authentic. And it makes a real impression on them. So they do that. At the other end of the spectrum, in medical schools, we see schools adding coaching and instruction in empathy. And remarkably enough, they do it in the same fundamental way, except this time it's with an old person. They bring in a very old person, again, same one over the course of a school year, and have the students interact with that person, talk about it beforehand, talk about it afterward, because they are realizing, the educators are realizing that this is important. And just one footnote on the medical school side. You may think, well, isn't it perfectly obvious that doctors should be empathetic with their patients? No, it isn't. And in fact, for many years, doctors were explicitly instructed not to empathize with parents for seemingly good, with patients, for seemingly good reasons. One, there was a fear that if the doctor was really feeling the emotions of the patient, that could compromise objective decision-making about the right treatment for that patient. And the other reason was, when you think of what doctors deal with, the genuine life and death issues, the fear was that if they got emotionally connected with all of these people in all of these cases, it would just be, it would immobilize them. They would be a wreck. They couldn't even operate. And so they were told not to empathize. Well, that's all behind us now. They've realized that actually there are tremendous advantages to doctors empathizing, and so they instruct it.
Sure, and so along those lines, when you think about young parents today, right, parents who have high school, college age kids, how exactly should they think about between the objective scores, what are a child's grades at a given point, or a GRE score or an MCAT score or an SAT score, relative to these soft skills? You talk about what people are like, right? So how should adults kind of compare and contrast these objective measurables versus this intangible?
Yeah, it's hard for them because, for just the reason you say, you get measurements on the traditional skills. Right? You get a report card, you get SAT scores, these things can be measured and are measured, and we get the measurements, and the old saying is, what gets measured gets managed, and that's true. The hard thing for parents is that they just have to make judgments about the skills of deep human interaction. And so, all you can say is, make your own judgment. It's clear that parents cannot expect schools to carry the burden on building these interpersonal skills, even though some schools are starting to do so. When I talk to parents, they often give me their judgment. They know their kids pretty well, and so they give me their judgment about how emotionally connected, how empathetic their different kids are, and they often differ a lot. And all you can do is try to help them do that, encourage them to interact with people, put them in settings where they will interact with people, model the behavior for them. It's all you can do, and you got to do it more than you used to.
Yeah, well, and it's because it's such a challenge, especially with the technological growth and things. And to switch gears a little bit, you talk about now the development of these skills, right? And the connection and the human connection, and you talk about really the importance of developing in the business setting, cohesive teams.
Yes.
What are some things that you look for as far as how do you develop one of those teams?
Yeah, it's a great question because teams are everywhere. Virtually everybody who works is part of a team of one kind or another, often more than one team. So it's how everything gets done, and the question of what makes a team effective does become this critically important question. The research on this, which is fascinating, is that team effectiveness is not what most of us think it is. It doesn't come from the cohesion of the team or the motivation or the satisfaction of the team. It doesn't come from the IQ of the team. The average IQ of the team does have a modest effect on its effectiveness. The IQ of the smartest member of the team is totally uncorrelated with the effectiveness of the team. It is mostly about the social sensitivity of the team members. The average level of social sensitivity on the team is the best indicator by far of whether that team's going to be effective. And so that means that in composing the team, that's what we need to worry about. And it's not what almost anybody worries about, right? You form teams because there are people who have to be represented there. They come from different parts of the company or whatever. They have to be represented on the team. Well, that is important, and we can't avoid that to some extent. But the critical factor in composing the team is going to be the social sensitivity, meaning, is this somebody who can read other people, who is interested in reading other people, who will not dominate the conversations of the meetings, but rather will make sure everybody gets their say, is encouraged to put ideas on the table, and can tell if somebody has an idea but isn't speaking up, and then will encourage that people to do so. It's those little things that turn out to be most important by far in team effectiveness. So what we've got to do is compose our teams on that basis. Really think about and by the way, these things like social sensitivity, they can be measured. We just don't measure them most of the time. But there are tests that are available that are not complicated or long or difficult that can help give you an idea. You just have to start doing it.
So when you talk about, you were talking earlier about, when Fortune magazine has the top 100 companies to work for, and inevitably they outperform, these companies because of their empathy toward clients. And you talk about the productivity of teams and how much more effective they can be when everyone's cohesive. Right. Why don't more people do it?
Yeah. It's kind of the obvious question, right? You can see this. Why don't more people do it? My observation, just based on years of looking at organizations, is that incentives have a lot to do with it. An awful lot of people direct themselves during the workday by choosing what is not going to get them in trouble with their boss, right? Okay. It's pretty fundamental. I don't want to get in trouble with my boss for doing this. I want to do what my organization rewards, explicitly or implicitly. And if it isn't all this stuff we're talking about, if it isn't being empathetic with other employees, then, maybe it just doesn't make any sense for me to do that. I'm just taking a chance, right? If it isn't, putting teams together in an untraditional way, because it'll be more effective, then just why? I'm just going to get in trouble, right? It's sad, but it really has to do with the explicit and implicit motivations in the company. And honestly, that has a lot to do with culture, the culture of the organization. I can remember when CEOs didn't even want to talk about corporate culture because it was soft and squishy, and you couldn't measure it and stuff. Now they all want to talk about it. They all want to, because they all have realized this is actually the key to whether we rise or fall.
And I don't know if that leads then into, you make a point about the importance of storytelling.
Yes.
And why that's going to be important. And so is kind of that storytelling, not only from an individual perspective, but also from a corporate perspective, the business telling its story effectively. Yeah. And how does that translate into, into its own success going forward?
Yeah. This is such a fundamental concept, and many organizations struggle with it. First of all, within the company, storytelling is incredibly valuable because we realize that we have to reach people, even people who are employees. In theory, we can tell them what to do. We all know that in practice, you can tell them what to do, but they're going to do what they feel deeply impelled to do. They're not just on an assembly line turning wrenches and so forth. They are not mere human machines. They are human beings. They are making their own choices about what they're going to do every day. If you want to influence them, you don't do it primarily with facts and figures. You do it with stories, because that reaches them deeply. It reaches their emotions. Look, we all know this. We don't need the evidence. There is evidence. There's lots of evidence. Who needs it? We all know that if you want to change somebody's mind, if you want to inspire them to act, you tell them a story. There's a saying that logic leads to conclusions, emotion leads to actions. And that's what we have to do. So storytelling is becoming critically important. And for the corporation as a whole, by the way, or the business, whatever form it takes, for the business as a whole, there is a realization spreading that every business has to have a story. And if it has a story, it becomes a much more powerful, effective business. Powerful in the good sense, meaning people look to it, people respect it. But it has to have a story. It might be the story of how it came to be. It might be a story about what it does in the world. But it has to formulate and propagate that story.
In your experience, whether early in your career, at this point in your career, anywhere in between, is there a corporate story that either you've been influenced by or one that you've told that was particularly resonating for you?
There's a great example of this. A lot of great examples, but there's a great example of this that is actually very well known, but it's still a great example, and that's the Southwest Airlines example. In giving talks, I often hesitate to use Southwest Airlines examples simply because they're used so often. It is such a great example of so many good things. But it is a particularly great example of storytelling because the strength of that company is the culture. Above all else, it's a terrible business. Look, airlines are a terrible business, all right? They're awful. You are subject to fuel prices and capital costs, things over which you have no control. It's grindingly competitive. It's just a hard business. How do they succeed? By the way, they're the only airline ever that's been profitable every single year for 45 years. The only one. For many years, until the most recent consolidations, they were the highest market value. They were the most valuable airline in the world. I'd ask people, what's the most valuable? They'd say British Airways, Singapore Air, or United, or American. No, for years and years it was Southwest. Okay, how do they do it? It's the culture of the company. And how did they build this culture? Explicitly through storytelling. Okay? They don't tell you what the culture is. They don't tell employees. They show them. And when somebody in the company does what the company wants to reinforce, they just spread that story around. An employee who did something heroic for a customer. And anybody who works there can tell you lots of these stories. The customer who came to the airport about to go on a trip with her dog, a big dog. and was surprised to find that that the airline didn't really have a way of handling that. She'd made no arrangements. She's at the desk, you know, talking to the ticket agent, and she says, well, what am I going to do? You know, I can't go home, I don't have time. And the ticket agent said, just leave it with me for a week. When you come back, I'll give you the dog back. You know, well, that was doing something above and beyond, right? Heroic for the customer. But everybody in the company knows that story. You know, you ask a baggage handler there, loading up the plane, what are you doing? And it's like, they don't say I'm throwing bags in the plane. They say I'm helping a grandmother visit her grandchildren, right? Because those stories have been spread over the years. They do it better than anybody. And it's a million little stories like that.
Well, what's fascinating about the way you're saying it is that it's providing this larger context to a simple act. I mean, your baggage handler example, it's not a bag on a conveyor belt. It's it's really providing a service and a contextually important service, you know, to somebody else.
Right.
You know, as a final question for you, any ideas for your next book?
I'll tell you, it's funny that you should ask that question at this point, because I don't know what the next book is going to be. I'm thinking a lot about it. But one thing I've decided is I want it to be a story. Because these other books that I've written have been topic books. They've been about ideas, which I much enjoy, but man, they are a lot of work. Books like that are a lot of work to write. I want to tell a story. And so I am scanning, all right? I'm on the lookout for the right story to tell. I don't know what it is yet, but that's what I'm looking for.
Great. Well, thanks. We appreciate you coming in today.
My great pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today for Inside the Chamber. And thanks to Geoff Colvin for taking the time to chat with us. Please join us for the next Inside the Chamber as we meet with our city leaders to talk about the state of our city.